Let's start with the moment of impact. It's nighttime, January 29th, just before 9 p.m. local over Washington, D.C. Ignore this plane taking off. It's not directly involved. It's these two dots you want to keep your eye on. This is a Sikorsky H-60, a Black Hawk military helicopter. This is American Eagle Flight 5342. That's an American Airlines plane on approach for a landing at Reagan Washington National Airport. They're about to crash into each other. What that would have sounded like from a comms perspective, we can begin to understand, courtesy of a site called Live ATC. They monitor air traffic communication for more than 1,000 airports worldwide.
Pat 25, CRJ in flight. Pat 25, pass line is CRJ.
Pat 25, that's the helicopter. CRJ, that's the passenger plane with 64 people on board. What you're hearing there is air traffic control asking the helicopter pilot if they see the plane, because 21 seconds later, we now know they would collide in midair.
American 472, Washington, 1 star, 32017. Tower, did you see that?
And what everybody nearby would have seen was this: two lights converging and a fireball, a devastating, deadly impact. What witnesses described as a stream of sparks.
We were just talking. Next thing you know, I heard a loud explosion. I looked to the left, saw just a big ball of fire, and then wreckage just falling down towards the river. And my neighbor hollered out, "Oh my God, that's a plane."
But then silence. From that point on, if you saw a stream of lights, they were probably the flashing lights of first responders, because there was no fiery ground explosion. Both the plane and the helicopter crashed into the Potomac River. We can see that on flight radar trackers like this one from FlightAware. The particular route of this passenger plane happens just about every day, a 2.5-hour flight from Wichita, Kansas to Reagan National in DC. You can see from this flight on January 27th what an approach from the north might look like. This plane entered a holding pattern before touching down. The day before, a relatively smooth approach from the south. But you can see the difference with the flight that just crashed. It swings a little wider, heading for a different runway. But we lose the signal right at the river, well short of the airport itself. The most immediate question for first responders would have been, could anyone possibly have survived?
Very quickly, this call escalated. Responders realized that they had a plane crash and immediately escalated to a response that ultimately included about 300 people.
But there were two big problems. It was dark and it was cold. Divers had to contend with chunks of ice among the debris. The fuselage of the plane split into 3 parts. The helicopter reportedly upside down.
The challenges are access. The water that we're operating in is about 8 feet deep. There is wind, there is pieces of ice out there, so it's just dangerous and hard to work in.
And for a passenger suddenly plunged into ice-cold water, physiologically a few things happen. You start to gasp for air, hyperventilate, cold shock affects your thinking, your decision-making. Your heart rate shoots up, and within minutes, you lose muscle control. Then, hypothermia sets in. The night of the crash, this was a search and rescue mission. The following morning, it was a recovery operation.
At this point, we don't believe there are any survivors from this accident. And we have recovered 27 people from the plane and 1 from the helicopter.
According to the Pentagon, there were 3 soldiers in the Black Hawk helicopter. On the plane, according to American Airlines, 64 people. 60 of them passengers, 2 flight attendants, and 2 pilots.
We will continue to work to find all the bodies and collect them and reunite them with their loved ones.
U.S. Figure Skating, that's the American governing body for the sport. They've also confirmed several of their members were on board. Athletes, coaches, returning from a development camp and a national championship in Wichita this week.
Still waiting on a lot of identifications. We do know that a large amount, at least 14 of the 64 people who died on the plane in this crash were from the U.S. figure skating community.
But there's an important question investigators will try to answer over the coming months, maybe even years. How could something like this have happened?
And at this time, we don't know why the military aircraft came into the path the PSA aircraft.
We can hear from air traffic control recordings. Flight 5342, the passenger plane, was cleared to land, but so too was the helicopter cleared to fly.
The helicopter was in a standard pattern. If you live in the DC area, you'll see helicopters up and down the river.
This is true. Reagan National is one of the more complex airports to navigate in the U.S. because of its proximity to military infrastructure, the U.S. Capitol, the White House, a heavy urban center. There are restrictions on where you can fly, what kind of approaches you can make. There are commercial flights, military flights. It's busy.
This is a geographically constrained airport. It's relatively small that moves a lot of airplanes and helicopters through the airspace.
This was not unusual with military aircraft flying the river and aircraft landing at DCA.
But of course, mid-air crashes are exceedingly rare. We can glean from air traffic control transcripts that the Army helicopter pilot both had been warned of the incoming plane and believed it could have been avoided. The pilot said, "Pat 25 has aircraft in sight. Request visual separation." Requesting visual separation means the pilot is asking for and taking responsibility for maintaining a safe distance from other aircraft using their own eyes. That's the visual separation, as opposed to relying on air traffic control instructions or radar. But about 13 seconds later, the crash.
Everything was standard, they say, in the lead up to the crash, but something went wrong. Clearly something went horribly wrong.
So what we don't know, why couldn't the helicopter pilot, who the US Army says was flying a training mission, why couldn't the pilot avoid the crash? Did the pilot have eyes on the right plane? And on the flip side, was the passenger plane pilot even aware the helicopter was on a collision course? Listen to what the US Secretary of Transportation had to say about this.
I don't want to say too much on the communication between the helicopter in the tower and the airline in the tower, but I will say this: there was communication. It was, I would say, standard communication. So there was not a breakdown, if that's your question, in communication between the military helicopter and the American Airlines flight. There was communication between the aircraft and the tower.
Which sounds like there was no communication issue. But then there is a follow-up from the reporter. Was the plane pilot aware of the helicopter? This was the answer, which avoids the question.
I would say the helicopter was aware that there was a plane in the area.
Now, normally, commercial jets have electronic transponders that alert everybody when different aircraft are getting dangerously close. But it's not clear whether they would have activated at this altitude, and at least one expert told CBC this safeguard may not even have been in place because the military operates on literally a different wavelength.
So the Black Hawk doesn't have, it's not going to have a transponder, or if it does, it's usually an internal military transponder that's not picked up commercially.
Either way, the US president began casting blame within about 3 hours of the crash on social media. It is a clear night. The lights on the plane were blazing. Why didn't the helicopter go up or down or turn? Why didn't the control tower tell the helicopter what to do instead of asking if they saw the plane? This is a bad situation that looks like it should have been prevented. Not good. And at a news conference later that same day,
the people in the helicopter should have seen where they were going. You had a confluence of bad decisions that were made.
No investigation has yet come anywhere close to reaching any kind of conclusion. So many questions don't have answers right now. But there is work to do to explain an event that hasn't happened in the US on this scale in well over a decade.